Hello everyone and welcome back to another MCAT ACE lecture. In today's lecture we are going to discuss the eukaryotes, prokaryotes and viruses. So since this is kind of like a long lecture, we are going to divide it into two sections. In the first video or part 1, we are going to discuss cell theory and then focus more on prokaryotes, including different modes of classification for prokaryotes, and then go over structure and their genetics. And then in the second lecture, we will go over eukaryotic cells, describe the function of different organelles, cytoskeleton, and then finally go over the mechanism of replication of viruses, prions, and virions, and then as always, to conclude our lecture with some practice questions. All right, so starting with the first part of this lecture, let's start with the cell theory. So the first time that the cell was discovered was in the 17th century, and that was when Robert Hooke has observed a slice of cork under a compound microscope. All he could see was a multitude of tiny pores that resembled kind of like compartments of a honeycomb. And from there on, he gave the name cell to these structures. But then, because a cork was kind of like a dead structure, he couldn't see the internal structures of a living cell. It was like about 10 years later that scientists were able to see a live cell under a microscope, and they described cells as moving organisms. So the cell theory basically refers to the idea that all living organisms are made of cells. So all living organisms are made of cells. Then the second part of cell theory tells us that the cells are the basic building unit of life. So cells are the basic building unit of life. And then the third point is that new cells arise from pre-existing cells that divide in two. So new cells arise from pre-existing cells that divide into two. Okay, now these first 3 points are referred to as classic cell theory, but then over time, when there has been advances in genetics and molecular biology techniques, new tenets have been added to the cell theory. So therefore, the modern cell theory has added these new points, which include that cells carry hereditary information that are passed from parents to daughter cells during every division. So cells carry hereditary information, like for instance DNA, that is passed to daughter cells in every division. The next point is that some organisms are made of only one cell, while others are made of multiple cells. And so these are unicellular versus multicellular organisms. And then finally, modern cell theory states that there is energy flow within cells. So there is energy flow, or in other words, there is metabolism that is happening inside cells. Okay. Now there are some exceptions to the cell theory, and these include, for instance, mitochondria and chloroplasts. Because they are not dependent on the cell division, and they have their own genetic material and are self-replicating independent of the rest of the cell. So these have own genetic material and are self-replicating independent of the rest of the cell. And then the other exception is the viruses, which have many features of life, but they're unable to reproduce on their own. So unable to reproduce on their own. and they have to be inside a host cell in order to be able to introduce. So therefore, since these viruses are unable to reproduce on their own, they are not considered as a living organism. And then referring back to the processes of evolution, evolution actually says that we have all developed from simple cells that later on became multicellular, and no one exactly can tell what had happened because we can't go back in time, but there are hypotheses about how different cells have developed. So first let me go over the definition of what prokaryote mean and what eukaryote mean. Okay, so first starting with prokaryote, which are thought to be the very first cells that have developed, and later on it's thought that eukaryote have developed from prokaryotic cells. So what prokaryote basically mean is that pro means before and karyote means nucleus. So it's before a nucleus has developed. In other words, prokaryotes don't have a nucleus, versus eukaryotic cells, they do have a nucleus, and the meaning of eukaryote is true nucleus. And then the theory is about how chloroplasts and mitochondria have developed in the eukaryotic cells. It's thought that when there was an anaerobic eukaryotic cell that was not using oxygen for energy production, it must have engulfed a prokaryotic cell that was aerobic. It was using oxygen to produce energy. And over time, this prokaryotic cell has been converted into mitochondrion, which uses oxygen for energy production. And then later on, this primitive eukaryotic cells picked up another prokaryotic cell that is able to use photosynthesis in order to generate carbohydrates from light and CO2 and water. And so that's how plant cells have developed. Now, there are many different findings that keep supporting the fact that chloroplasts and mitochondria were probably primitive prokaryotic cells that have been engulfed by eukaryotic cells. Like for instance, the size of chloroplasts and mitochondria is the same as prokaryotic cells. They have the same ribosome structure. They have their own DNA. So there are many different features of these chloroplasts and mitochondria that support the fact that eukaryotic cells probably engulf these prokaryotes, and over time they turn into the organelles that are used for energy production as mitochondria, or production of sugar and other carbohydrates, like for instance glucose, from sunlight that combines CO2 with water. All right, now moving to classification of cells.